we have a complicated immigration system. And immigration is in the news right now, and I think that there are churches all over the country that are trying to figure out, do we need to respond? How do we need to respond? And of course, the opinions that people have in most of those churches are really across a wide spectrum, and so it's difficult to know how to respond. But there are over 92 passages in Scripture that call us to practice biblical hospitality. They call us to welcome the stranger. So whatever we do, we can't ignore the question. We really do have to discern, how do we respond? But most of us actually know very little about our immigration system. So this is a short webinar and video, and anybody who receives this will also receive the PowerPoint on how our immigration system works, how it doesn't work, what we need to do as the church, and how to do it. The great Christian writer Henry Nouwen said that one of the core movements of sanctification is the movement from hostility to hospitality. The reaction of most of us to the other is reasonably, depending on who the other is, that the other may be a threat. And so the hostility is natural when you're facing a threat. It gives us the energy to defend the people that we love. But the biblical word on hospitality is a response to the fact that our natural response to a threat is not a response to the full reality of who the other is. So we see the stranger naturally as a threat, but the Bible teaches us in those 92 passages that the stranger can also be a blessing, and that we are called to welcome the stranger and to love the stranger. What does that mean in the context of our current immigration system? And I do want to say that we do have a choice in terms of our current immigration system. We have the gifts of democracy. And stewardship is all about using all of your gifts in the service of our Lord. So we really can make an impact on the current system. So we need to understand what it is and what kind of impact is potential. Most people in our society at this moment know that our immigration system is ineffective. But what people don't realize is if you go a step closer, it's illogical. It makes the DMV and the IRS look like sane, well-oiled machines in comparison. And if you get a step closer than that, you know that it is profoundly inhumane and that there are alternatives available. We have had 2 bipartisan legislative proposals in the last 15 years that would solve many of the worst problems in our immigration system. When polled, the average American polled, about 75% of people who are polled read these proposals and think that that's the kind of immigration system that they would like. But we have not yet had the political will to pass it. So let's start with immigration basics. How does it work? One of the most common misconceptions when I speak in churches is that anybody who wants to can come to this country. They just have to stand in line. But this is not our grandmother's immigration system. Many of the people who came a couple of generations ago would be completely unable to come under the current system. Under the current system, there are only a few categories that you need to fit in to be able to even apply to come to this country. The first category, which is a category that I'm very grateful as a Christian, is because it fits my Christian values, is incorporated into our immigration system, is that we care about family unity. If there are members of a family who are citizens and a member of our families who are immigrants, we want to keep that family together. So that's a category. Do you have family members that are U.S. citizens or permanent residents? Now we're going to talk in the ways in which, when I talk about how the system doesn't work, we're going to talk about the definition of family and who fits into this and how it works. But right now I just want you to understand that that's the first category. The second category is that if you're an employer, you're an American employer, and you want an immigrant to work for you, you can petition for a work visa. You can petition for a permanent residency on the basis of a work visa. Permanent residency, by the way, is referred to on the street as a green card. So you can petition. Now, of course, there are requirements around that, including that you have to be able to show that an American citizen doesn't want that job. So you have to show that. And secondly, there are limits to how many people that can come in under each occupational category. So it's not, an employer cannot petition for anybody that they want to come, but they can petition within those conditions. The third category is asylum. Asylum goes back to the Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations at the end of World War II. We signed it along with countries all over the world. Basically, we said that if somebody had credible fear of violent persecution because of their race, religion, or a number of other categories in their home country, that we would let them in. So asylum and the refugee programs are both a response to that declaration, to our commitment to that declaration. If the difference between refugees and asylees is that refugees petition at a refugee center in another country, and asylees petition at our border. If you petition as a refugee, you will get refugee benefits for a limited amount of time when you come. If you petition under asylum, you will get no benefits, but you will be able to enter the country. Under our concern for people that are suffering violence, persecution, or unjust violence, we also have U visas, which are for victims of domestic violence, and we have T visas, which are for victims of trafficking. But those are basically the three main categories. There are a couple of other categories. If you invest $1 million in our country, you can get a green card right away. Now, that doesn't apply to most people in our society or even around the world, but you should just know that it exists. There is also an international lottery, not for people who are already here, but for people anywhere in the world who want to come to the United States. And it's, of course, millions and millions of people, and once in a while somebody wins the lottery, so you should know that that exists. There are also different ways to have temporary status. You can get a visitor's visa, although that's not simple. When I was pregnant, my husband at the time was an immigrant, and when I was pregnant, we wanted to bring my mother-in-law, and because she did not have 15,000 American dollars worth in her bank account, she was unable to get a visitor's visa. They thought that she was a risk for staying, even though she had 36 grandchildren in Guatemala and only one pending grandchild here. So it's not always simple to get a tourist visa, but that isn't temporary status you can get. You can get a student visa. Again, you have to pass some pretty difficult tests to get one, and you also have to have a way of supporting yourself without working in this country. You can apply to be a guest worker. It's a very small program, about 250,000 people a year, to come and work temporarily in this country in certain categories. And you can apply for deferred deportation, which means that if you're in this country, but you have a deportation order, that Immigration and Customs Enforcement can decide to defer that deportation order instead of enforcing it from year to year. So if you've heard of deferred action for childhood arrivals, for people who arrived in this country as young children and who we've invested in through our public school system and who want to be part of our society and give back, they don't have legal status. Many people think they now do. They don't. Through what they have through the deferred action for childhood arrivals is deferred deportation, that they can stay temporarily. So those are the immigration basics. If you want to come to this country, those are your options. There aren't any others. But those options, as I mentioned before, don't work very well. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of how they don't work. Since 1995, we have a flat limit of 5,000 visas a year for what we call unskilled workers, and that includes all farm workers. The problem with that is that we have imported, for the vast majority of our history as the United States, we have imported about 80% of our farm labor. Slavery was a giant program to import farm workers. So you can see that there's a little problem here. As Richard Land of the Southern Baptist says, we give people a real double message. On the one hand, we need you to come as a farm worker. We need your labor. On the other hand, we're not going to allow you to come legally. So that's a little broken place in our system. We could fix that. The proposed legislation that passed the Senate but did not pass the House a couple of years ago would have used a complicated computer program to figure out our actual economic needs as a country at any given time, and to make sure that the work visas that we made available fit our actual needs. It's not rocket science, it's not impossible. We just don't do it. It's a broken place. So I want this to come home to us through a story. Rosa was a member of my congregation. I was a pastor in Fresno, California. She came from Michoacan, Mexico, where her family had farmed corn successfully for 8 generations. They loved where they lived. They loved their little corn farm. But the North American Free Trade Agreement passed, and our agribusiness companies began selling corn in Michoacan at a price that Rosa could not possibly compete with. Why couldn't she compete with it? It wasn't American know-how, it was the truth that our agricultural industry is subsidized. And so there's no way that Rosa could produce corn more cheaply than they could. So she lost the family farm. And at the same time, her husband passed away. And so she was left in a very bad situation because the whole bottom had fallen out of the economy of Michoacan. It was a corn-based economy. So she couldn't get another job, and she had no way to support her children. What would you do to feed your children? So she did not want to come to the United States. She is a conservative Christian and did not see the United States as a place that she wanted to raise her kids. But she came up to the Mexican side of the border, and she went to work for an international company. It wasn't a great job. There was sexual harassment, but she could send the money back to her mother, who was taking care of the kids, and the kids could eat. Then the international factory closed and went to Indonesia, where they could pay even less than they could pay in Mexico. That's the point at which Rosa crossed the border and became a farm worker. She would desperately love to be a legal farm worker, but there aren't enough visas available. So that's what the broken system looks like in Rosa's case and in the case of many others. One of the biggest waves of immigration we've had in recent history was right after the corn crisis hit in Michoacan. When Rosa came, she left all of the children with her mother except for the baby, who was 2 years old. She brought him with her. He grew up all his life in Fresno. Great kid, all-American kid, except that he's not an American. Good grades, on the football team. He graduated and he really wanted to go to college, but he knew that he was undocumented. He knew that he couldn't work legally in this country. And so he got a job at the local Sizzler, the little Sizzler restaurant around the corner from his house, where they knew him. And because he's a wonderful worker, he quickly got promoted to be an assistant manager. And he married his high school sweetheart, Kathy, whose grandparents had come over from Ireland when it was a very different system. Kathy got pregnant, and Kathy said, Jose, I'm going to petition for you. I'm an American citizen. This is ridiculous. You should be able to fulfill your potential in this country and give back to society and not be frightened of deportation. So she petitioned for him, and they ran headlong into the bar. The bar is a little law passed in 1995 with a larger package that says that if you've been in this country more than a year undocumented and it can be proven, you have to go back to your home country for 10 years, before you can be considered for immigration. So here's Kathy pregnant. What are they going to do? Is Jose going to go back alone for 10 years? Is he going to take Kathy with him? Her whole family is here? That's a broken system. When people hear about that, they say, wait a minute, there has to be a solution. But there isn't. Let me give you one more example. Liliana's family was also caught in the corn crisis, but they were a middle-class family. They had corn processing plants. They saw the handwriting on the wall and they got out. They sold everything and they got visas to be guest workers in the fields. So they were legal, Liliana, however, was in her last year of high school, and she did not want, she's very ambitious, she's very smart. She wanted to be a psychologist. She wanted to graduate in her own language. So she stayed behind, and she graduated thinking she could come afterwards, but she turned 18 in the process. And so they couldn't bring her, and the wait to come would have been 12 years. She didn't want to wait 12 years to see her family, so she did something foolish. How many of you did something foolish when you were 18? She bought a false birth certificate. She tried to cross with it, and they caught her, and they said, "Is this you?" And she said no, and went back. Then she crossed through the river, like most people do, through the desert. And she came to live with her family. They were all legal. She wasn't. She worked in the fields. And she met the love of her life, Jerry, an American citizen who is a truck driver. And they lived together for a few years as husband and wife, bought up their own little house. You know, he worked a couple jobs. She had 2 kids. She was pregnant with the third. And Jerry said, "You know, Liliana, I really want to petition for you because this is ridiculous. Everyone else is legal in your family." So he petitions for her. She gets a work permit. They go through the process. They're about to have their final interview. They have a party waiting at home. You know, it's a multicultural party, hot dogs, tamales. And the immigration official is going over their paperwork, and he looks down and his face changes. And he says to her, "Oh, honey, you cannot immigrate to this country. You committed a felony. You falsely claimed to be a U.S. citizen. And the penalty for that particular felony is a lifetime bar to immigration, no waivers, and no appeals. Go home, say goodbye to your kids or decide to take them with you, and go back." So they go home devastated. Liliana's father at that point has terminal cancer. She doesn't want to leave. And so they pray about it, and they decide to stay. They decide that no one's going to come after them, that the people are going to go after criminals, not after people like them. They're leaders in their church. They're leaders in their community. Well, she has the baby, and he's 3 months old, and she's breastfeeding him and getting her 7-year-old and 4-year-old ready for school. And there's a knock at the door, and it's 5 immigration agents. And they say to her, you know, "You had the chance to leave voluntarily. You're coming with us now." So her 7-year-old starts crying, and he says, "I don't understand. We learned in school that the police take bad people. My mommy is not a bad mommy. My mommy is the best mommy. Why are you taking my mommy?" At which point Liliana starts crying, and one of the immigration agents says to her, "Lady, don't waste your tears." And the other one, who's a woman, says, "How long do you need to say goodbye?" And she said, "Well, give me a week." And so they say, "We'll give you a few days." And she goes into sanctuary in her church, which is a longer story, where we fight for her for years, but there's no legal alternative. No waivers, no appeals. We finally get her what's called deferred deportation, that she can stay in the country with the permission of ICE as a low priority for detention and deportation every year, which she's had for a number of years. Of course, now under the Trump administration, they are saying that they can revoke the deferred deportation of anybody any moment, and they've already started revoking them. So we're very concerned about her. But this is the unforgivable felony. We asked Liliana's lawyer how frequent this happened. You know, how rare was this? And she said she got 1 case a week. So there are a number of people caught in this crazy situation. This is what it means to have a broken system. In 2007, we had a bipartisan bill. It was called McCain-Kennedy. When we ran it by the average American, about 75% support. The DREAM Act, which would create a category for kids like Jose, that it would create a line for them to stand in where they wouldn't have to go back for 10 years before they could get some kind of immigration relief, gets about 90% support when you poll. But we haven't been able to win either, because the calls to Congress when the legislation was pending were about 50-1 against, and the calls in response to the DREAM Act were about 10-1 against, because the average American never calls your congressperson unless it's about you or people you know. And immigration is not about enough Americans. And so the people who call are the people who think that immigrants are the problem, particularly undocumented immigrants, and they call constantly. And so we can't get the political will together to pass it. Now, by 2013, we had built a stronger base, and we were able to have a bipartisan bill, which was actually a much better bill than 2007, pass the Senate. And even though we had enough Democratic and Republican votes in the House, John Boehner did not bring it to the floor for a discussion or for a vote. So we did not have the political will to pass that either. Now, the difference between 2007 and 2013 had a lot to do with the church. What I saw when I realized that we lost because we didn't have a broad enough coalition that was passionate enough is that I thought to myself, and I wasn't the only one, there were a number of us, what is the one institution in our society that is mandated to care passionately about people that are not us? If we don't care passionately about people who are not us, we are not followers of Jesus Christ, who loves everyone equally. So I realized that the church was the only solution, that if we could get immigrant and non-immigrant congregations together, that we could create the exchange of hope and passion. Because immigrants don't participate, even legal immigrants, even people who are related to immigrants, because we don't have hope that we can win. We know we're too small in numbers. And people who are non-immigrants don't participate because they don't have the passion. But when we know each other as brothers and sisters in Christ, we have the exchange of hope and passion, and people get involved. This is a Hebrews 13 movement that when immigrants discover that we should not neglect to show hospitality to strangers because by doing so you may entertain angels without knowing it, and they realize that angels in Koine Greek doesn't just mean celestial beings with wings, but it means any messenger of God sent to bring a blessing, immigrants sometimes begin to realize that maybe God sent them to this country to bring a blessing. Reverend Rene Molina came here, and when he came here, his church had, excuse me, I'm having a little problem with the lights here. There it goes. His church had 10 members, and they now have around 4,000, many of whom have come to Christ because of the ministry of Reverend Rene and Hannelore Molina. I think in many ways he was sent here as a blessing, and certainly we have some evidence to that fact. So there's a Hebrews 13 piece of this, when immigrants themselves begin to stand up and to say, we need to share our stories. Then you can have what I see as an Ephesians 2 and John 17 phenomena, which is you begin to have the breaking down of the dividing wall of hostility between people who are different races, as we had between the Jews and Gentiles. And then we see the witness of John 17, that the world knows that Jesus has come because of the unity of his followers. Often that particular scripture is used with the ecumenical movement. But, I don't think that the world necessarily knows that Jesus has come because Baptists and Methodists get together. They already think we're the same. They know that Jesus has come when something as amazing as immigrants and non-immigrants are fully united. So it's a Hebrews 13, Ephesians 2, John 17 phenomena that we're seeing rise up around the country that led in 2011 to the National Evangelical Immigration Table, the broadest coalition of evangelicals involved in social justice issues since abolition. On June 12th of 2013, I think, it may have been 2012, the National Evangelical Immigration Table came out publicly. We had Focus on the Family, InterVarsity, World Vision, World Relief, National Association of Evangelicals, all kinds of unexpected suspects, unusual suspects. We came out publicly, and 2 days later, the president signed the executive order offering the Dreamers deferred action for childhood arrivals, and one of our leaders got a phone call from President Obama, saying that he could not have done it without the church. So the church can be extremely powerful. Over the years, the National Evangelical Immigration Table has led a number of campaigns, including an I Was a Stranger bookmark with 40 scriptures on it that help people in churches to reflect on the biblical foundation for responding to this issue, and also believing legislators to reflect on that as well. We've had Pray for Reform breakfasts, and we really have had some results. In 2007, 83% of non-immigrant evangelicals were against immigration reform. In 2014, 74% were in favor. So that's a major miracle. Of course, right now we're in the wilderness on these issues. This is a little description of the Senate legislation that passed. Strategy for continuing to strengthen our borders. It was fully bipartisan. Something to do for the people who are here without legal residency because of our broken system. So it's a situation, it's not amnesty. They basically have to wait 10 years under this legislation. They have to have no significant criminal records and stable work records. But they can get residency after 10 years if they continue in that situation, and 3 more for citizenship. They cannot have used federal businesses or federal benefits or have been a public charge in any way, which of course are not available to immigrants, but they had to not have used them in a fraudulent way. There was a special situation for dreamers and agricultural workers, as well as religious workers, widows, certain physicians, parents of U.S. citizens. Most people don't know that U.S. citizen children cannot petition for their parents, except in situations of extreme and unusual hardship. So they have to be 21 in order to do that. But this would have made a different kind of arrangement around that. You could have gotten merit-based visas for extraordinary contributions. They had the adjustment of caps to respond to economic needs. We talked about the worker category. There was an expanded guest worker program with protection for workers. My favorite part of the whole bill was judicial discretion. Right now, our judges really have their hands tied, that they cannot respond to cases like Liliana's because there's a very set response that they have to give. It would have returned judicial discretion. It also would have given no permanent visas for extended family, so it had some conservative limits as well. Higher fees for applicants, but it would have given funding for helping agencies. So that's the bipartisan legislation that was developed by what they called the Gang of Eight, that passed the Senate and had enormous support in the House, but did not pass and therefore is dead. I wanted to also share with you about a new category of people that we're deeply concerned about, as many of us in the church, and that I think really reveals to you the brokenness of the system. I'm a Lutheran pastor. We have in our synod a sister relationship with the Lutheran Church of El Salvador, so we go down on short-term mission trips quite a bit. And if you go down on a short-term mission trip, you will stay with this lovely little grandma in the Lutheran guest house. As you see, that's her family there. Her name is Trinidad, and her family helps her. You'll see in the far corner, you'll see her grandchild, Josue, one of her favorite grandkids, although they are all her favorites. One day, Josue was at school, in high school, and the Mara Salvatrucha came to him. People refer to the Mara Salvatrucha as a gang, which is what it is in the United States. But in Central America, it's not a gang, it's an international mafia that gets its money from guns trafficking, human trafficking, and drugs trafficking, and the extortion of small businesses to the tune of about $600 million a year. And they go after teenagers and forcibly conscript the boys and forcibly turn the girls into girlfriends of the gangs. And they are controlling increasingly large territories of Central America. So the Mara Salvatrucha came to Josue at school and said, "We want you." Well, he's a Christian, and he was terrified and did not want to join. And he thought, I will go to my father, who is a strong man physically and a strong man spiritually, and he will protect me. So he ran home after school with the Mara in close pursuit. They got home, and that's a picture of his father. You can see there, Roberto. So his father had just gotten home from his job as a bus driver, and he came outside. He saw, Josue running home, and he said to the young people who were running after Josue, he said, "You can't have my son." Whereupon one of them took out a gun and shot him dead in the street. So the next day, Josue ran to stay with family members in the United States. Well, he's one of somewhere around 80,000 kids that have come over the last few years. Over 60% of them pass the credible fear test at the border. So that means that they're very likely to be eligible for asylum. In fact, if they have legal representation, about 77% of them are getting political asylum. But we don't provide free lawyers for people who are seeking for political asylum in this country. So it takes a while to find them a lawyer. It's not easy. And if they don't have a lawyer, only 7% of them get political asylum, which I'm sure you can imagine. If you're a teenager and you arrive in this country and you don't speak the language and you know nothing about the law, how are you going to represent yourself in an immigration court? It's just not realistic. One of the new clauses in one of the executive orders by President Trump's administration prioritizes the processing of unaccompanied children and youth without sponsors and restricts sponsors to people with legal residency. So sponsors have been able to be family members even if they were undocumented, but that would not be true under the guidelines that just came out. And so these kids would be targeted for fast processing, which is essentially a fast track to deportation because we won't be able to get them a lawyer in time. Just so that you really understand what's going on. If we love immigrant children, how we need to respond. If you're a mother in El Salvador and your child is even younger, like we have some 12-year-olds, 11-year-olds that are targeted, quite often you will come with your child. We will not just send them. But if you do, they're in a worse situation because the requirements for asylum, if a parent is with them, are very different than if a parent is not. So I hope that comes home to you, what it is that is going on and how we might need to respond. So there are many ways that we can respond. We can certainly respond pastorally with care and help, but really this is a public decision problem. If you love somebody and you respond in love, you need to respond, if we look from the perspective of stewardship, using everything that you've got. That means you can't just love with your heart, you have to love with your head as well. You have to love as intelligently and as effectively as you can. So if you love someone who's hungry, you can give them a fish, or it might be more intelligent and effective to teach them to fish. But if they take their fishing pole down to the pond and there's a wall around the pond, they can't access the pond to feed their family, even if they know how to fish. It's the same love that makes you take down the wall. The walls in our society are put up or taken down by public decisions. Private decisions are decisions that I make about that affect my family, my small business, my little church, maybe my block. A public decision affects a whole lot of people. So our legislators make public decisions, and it is those public decisions that will keep people safe, will be humane or inhumane for immigrants. We have in this country this great blessing, when we think again about stewardship, of the gifts of democracy, that we actually have the right to have a say in public decisions. In fact, I think we have a duty, because democracy doesn't work if people don't participate. But often we take those gifts and we hide them in the little handkerchief, or we bury them in the ground, thinking of the parable of the talents. We don't use them for the glory of God. And I think that stewardship calls everyone to use every gift for the glory of God. So we really need to participate in communicating with our representatives, with our public decision makers, to call them to create an immigration system on a local, to whatever extent we can, and federal level that is more effective, just, logical, and humane. So we need to call our legislators to live up to their divine purpose. As we read in Romans 13, our government has a divine purpose. And this is a scripture I'd like to close with, that this really talks about the divine purpose of government. It's a prayer for the king. And of course, in our time, the king is not the government, but I think that it still holds true. So I want to read this out loud, and I want to end with this and with a picture that I'd like you just to hold in your heart. This is Psalm 72, 1 through 4 and 12 through 14. Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to a king's son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. May the mountains yield prosperity for the people and the hills in righteousness. May he defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the needy, and crush the oppressor. For he delivers the needy when they call, the poor and those who have no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy, and saves the lives of the needy. And there is a variant version that says, save the lives of the children of the needy. From oppression and violence he redeems their life, and precious is their blood in his sight. A godly governor is someone who makes decisions that treat every man, woman, and child as precious. That would be my prayer for our current government. And of course, because the people govern also in a democracy, we are also responsible to carry out this divine mandate. This is a picture of an unaccompanied child sleeping in a detention center. And this is a picture that's very familiar to us in the Latino community. This is a picture of a guardian angel who is guarding these little children. And, may we be the guardian angels, the messengers of God, to guard vulnerable people in our communities and to get a system that is effective, logical, just, and humane. Thank you.